What Patton did after a German said you'll have to kill me. Chapter 1. The General Who Broke All the Rules. He was the most feared American commander in World War II. Not because of his tanks. Not because of his tactics. But because of what happened when someone dared to defy him personally. General George S. Patton had a rule that every soldier in the Third Army understood without being told. You obeyed. You moved. You won. That was the contract. But on a cold morning in 1945, a captured German officer looked Patton dead in the eyes, lifted his chin, and said 4 words that no one in that room could believe they were hearing. You will have to kill me. The room went absolutely silent. Every American soldier present held his breath. Because they all knew the same terrifying thing. They had no idea what Patton was going to do next. To understand what happened in that room, you first have to understand who George Patton actually was, not the myth, but the man. He was born in 1885 into a family that worshipped military glory. His grandfather died in the Civil War. His great-uncle died in the Civil War. War wasn't just something the Pattons did. It was something the Pattons were. By the time he reached World War II, Patton had already been controversial for a decade. He was the general who slapped a shell-shocked soldier and nearly lost his career. He was the general Eisenhower had to publicly humiliate just to keep him useful. He was the general whose mouth moved faster than any press officer could manage. But here is what most people don't know about Patton. Behind the pearl-handled revolvers and the theatrical cursing and the speeches that made men feel 10 feet tall, there was a deeply complicated philosophy about what it meant to be a soldier. And that philosophy was about to be tested in a way no one expected. Because the German officer who defied him wasn't just any prisoner. He was someone whose identity, when Patton finally learned it, would change everything about the encounter. To understand how Patton ended up face to face with this German, you need to understand the speed of what was happening around him. By early 1945, Patton's Third Army was moving across Europe at a pace that military historians still struggle to fully explain. They were covering ground so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up. Patton famously called Eisenhower begging for fuel the way other men beg for air. His soldiers were exhausted, filthy, and completely electric with momentum. They had broken out of Normandy. They had pivoted in a blizzard to relieve Bastogne. They had crossed rivers that military doctrine said couldn't be crossed at that speed. Patton's men believed they were unstoppable. And that belief, cultivated carefully by Patton himself, was a weapon. But momentum creates friction. And the faster you move, the more violently things can go wrong. On this particular day, a small advance unit had captured a group of German officers who had refused to retreat with their men. Most of them surrendered without incident. Most of them understood that the war was functionally over. One of them did not. And when word reached Patton that a prisoner was causing a scene, specifically, that a German officer was refusing to cooperate and had said something remarkable, Patton made a decision that surprised everyone. He went himself. The building was unremarkable. A commandeered farmhouse that smelled like mud and old wood and the particular cold that soaks into stone walls during a European winter. Patton walked in without ceremony. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. Every man in the room recognized the helmet, the posture, the absolute certainty of movement that belonged to exactly one human being on the planet. The German officer was seated. He was not bound. He had been treated, by all accounts, correctly. He was a professional soldier, and the Americans were extending professional courtesies even under the circumstances. When Patton entered, the German looked up. And something passed across his face that the American soldiers present would later describe differently depending on who you asked. Some said it was contempt. Some said it was recognition. One soldier, in a letter home that his family preserved for decades, described it as something closer to relief. Patton studied the man for a long moment. Then he asked, through an interpreter, what the problem was. The German straightened in his chair. He spoke in careful, measured German. The interpreter translated with a slight hesitation, as if searching for the right words. He says he will not provide information. He says his oath forbids it. He says if you want him to break his oath, you will have to kill him first. The American soldiers braced. Patton's expression did not change. And then he did something that nobody in that room had predicted. He laughed. Not a performative laugh. Not a cruel laugh. A genuine, sudden burst of laughter that filled the cold farmhouse and left every person in the room completely disoriented. The German officer blinked. This was not the response his training had prepared him for. Patton pulled up a chair, turned it backward, and sat down facing the German officer like two men settling in for a long conversation. He studied the man with what witnesses described as genuine curiosity. Then, through the interpreter, he said something remarkable. "I do exactly the same thing." The silence that followed that statement was different from the silence before. Before, it had been the silence of fear. Now it was the silence of confusion, of a script being thrown out the window and nobody knowing what came next. Patton told the interpreter to sit down. He leaned forward. And he began to talk to the German officer not as a captor to a prisoner, but as one soldier to another. What he said over the next 20 minutes would be repeated, in fragments, in letters, in post-war memoirs, for the rest of the century. But what the German officer said back to Patton is the part of this story that almost nobody knows. Patton began by asking the German officer about his service. Not to gather intelligence. Not to find a weakness. Simply to understand who the man was. The German was suspicious at first. He answered in short sentences, watching for the trap he was certain was coming. Patton listened. He nodded. He asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he actually understood military tactics, not in the abstract, but in the granular, specific way that only someone who had studied war obsessively could understand. The German's answers grew longer. At some point, nobody could say exactly when, the conversation shifted. The German officer began asking Patton questions. About the breakout from Normandy. About the relief of Bastogne. About crossing the Rhine. And Patton answered him. Openly. Candidly. With the particular pleasure of a man who loves his work and rarely gets to discuss it honestly. One of the American soldiers present later wrote that it felt like watching two chess grandmasters who had been playing against each other for years finally sit down at the same table. But there was something building beneath the surface of this conversation. Something the German officer was working toward. A question he was clearly gathering the courage to ask. When he finally asked it, Patton went very still. The German officer leaned forward. His voice dropped. He spoke for nearly 30 seconds before pausing for translation. The interpreter's face shifted in a way that made the American soldiers nervous. The translation came slowly. He wants to know if you believe Germany can still win this war. He says he is not asking to insult you. He says he is asking because he has heard things, from his own commanders, that he no longer believes. And he wants to hear the truth from someone he respects. The farmhouse was absolutely silent. This was not a strategic question. This was not an intelligence question. This was a man in profound crisis asking for something he could no longer get from his own side, an honest answer. Patton looked at the German for a long time. Then he told the interpreter to make absolutely certain the translation was exact. Word for word. And he answered. What he said was not what